Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to another episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, where we will continue exploring schizophrenia. Today, I'll be speaking to Randye Kaye to discuss the patient and family perspectives of schizophrenia, as she narrated in her memoir titled Ben Behind His Voices. Ben Behind His Voices, along with her other best selling book, Happier Made Simple, is tied into her work as a motivational speaker, as a radio and podcast host, actress, singer, teacher, and mental health advocate. Quite a diverse platform. As well as her life as a wife, a mother, and surprise, surprise, a grandmother as well. Randye argues that life balance is a myth and that it's all about the mosaic you create by creating space for work, home, and art. She has narrated over 185 audiobooks so far, all available on Audible. She also leads fun and interactive workshops, teamwork, customer service, self-esteem, presentation skills, humor. I guess there are more than that. And she's also an inspiring keynote speaker talking about connection and communication. What she said is the more serious side. She speaks to groups of doctors, nurses, medical students, families, providers, and legislators regarding the family experience with mental illness when mental health illness hits. And this is such a platform. We're also talking to doctors, nurses, and I think a broad spectrum. So, Randye Kaye, thank you very much for joining me and welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. So just so you know, my name is Randye. I know the E is confusing. My mother added an extra E to my name so people would not think I was a boy. So just pretend the E is not there and it's Randye. So I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you for continuing to spread awareness about schizophrenia. I always feel like it's the mental illness that has the least accurate portrayal in the media and maybe in medical schools as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. And Randye, I will make a point to pronounce it correctly. Yeah, I mean, your book portrayed more than what I thought was schizophrenia, and one of the reasons for asking you to speak. But why did you write the book? It's a personal thing, isn't it? You're talking about your son's experience of mental illness, yours as well. Why did you decide to put that down on paper?
Well, I was asked to, basically, is the story. My son, who I call Ben for public purposes, it's not his real name, but it actually allows me to speak a little less emotionally about him by using a different name, so I don't cry when I do keynotes and things. He also asked me not to use his real name. I was making a living as a radio broadcaster and a theater actor and a voiceover talent, raising my two kids alone as a single parent when my son started exhibiting these really strange symptoms. Now, adolescence is strange. As you know, neurologists know the frontal cortex is still developing, and there's a lot of things that happen in adolescence. And like many families, I'm like, oh, this is a tough adolescence. It wasn't until he was 18 or 19 that it it got so out of control that I started seeking a more neurological diagnosis. And during that time, I sought education and support through an American organization called NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And what I found most helpful was learning about various mental illnesses, the education aspect. So I began to teach a class they have called Family to Family, where family members like me, I don't have an MD, although maybe in my next life I'll do that, but I certainly have learned a lot about schizophrenia. And in this free course called Family to Family, trained family members like myself lead a now 8-week free class teaching family members about mental illnesses and communication and various things. And I found that education and understanding my son's illness helped me. And the other thing that helped me so much and helped so many human beings so much is stories. I needed to hear other people's stories. I'm passionate about storytelling. It's a big part of human connection. And so as I was teaching these classes and sharing tidbits of our individual story and experiences with these concepts, people kept going, wow, you should write a book. So I thought about it, and I can write, but I don't love to write. It's just like, I got to sit down and write. Many writers feel the same way. And I happened to be in a position where I left my full-time job in radio, and I had a 6-month period of getting paid and not being allowed to seek radio work with a non-compete. And I thought, if I'm ever going to write the book, I'm going to do it now, because I'm getting paid to not work, essentially, in part of my field. So the time was right. In order to make myself do it, I took a writing class because I knew I'd have to provide chapters. I need deadlines. I know myself, I need deadlines. And by the time I finished that writing class, I had 5 or 6 chapters, and then the ball was rolling. So I wrote it because people asked me to. I finished it because it was started, and I felt it was important to the world to spread a story of understanding. And the subtitle of the book, One Family's Journey from the Chaos of Schizophrenia to Hope. I had never read a memoir that ended in any hope at all. And the book is over 10 years old, so I will say where the book ends, a lot has happened since then, and I did put out an updated audiobook version a couple of years ago, and things have happened even since then, because it's an ongoing roller coaster when someone in your family has mental illness. So I wrote it to educate families, practitioners, and people with schizophrenia about what it's like for the family when someone you love is basically taken over by a serious mental illness.
So I'm assuming that being asked means there was a gap. I don't want to say in the market, but there's a gap out there for information about this, isn't it? So let's go back to how we'll call him, stick to Ben, of course, how things
Yes.
started in mid-teens. You said he began to change. What did you notice then?
So, and I will just say, as you probably know, but your listeners may not, schizophrenia in males typically begins the way it began in my son, which is what they call a prodromal stage, when things are developing, and it's difficult to know what the diagnosis is. So there were 2 to 3 years starting in mid-teens, which again is typical for males. Other people, schizophrenia just hits all of a sudden with psychosis in college or something, and that's more typical for females. But for my son, he was always a tiny bit anxious, but it was manageable. So he had focus issues, but we just managed it with behavioral changes. There was no medication involved. And adolescence is tough, but when he made the switch from a small, friendly school that he went to through 8th grade, I know in the UK it's different, so that they're about 13 or 14, and then they go to high school, which is age like 14 to 18. When my son went to high school, he started to be very afraid, like nobody likes me, and I figured, well, it's a new school. Things are difficult. It's a behavior change. We made it as easy as possible. He was on scholarship, but he would come home and say, somebody saw me kiss a girl and now nobody will talk to me. And I just thought, okay, he's having adjustment issues, things like that. He managed to get through a year and a half of high school and by the skin of his teeth get good grades by doing everything at the last minute, but he wasn't happy anymore in school. But he was happy on the weekends in the youth group with his friends. But his mood swings were extreme, and I just thought it was a tough adolescence, a tough adjustment. But I think a big clue came when halfway through his sophomore year, that's the second year of high school, his grades really started to crash, and he started to really not want to go to school, really not do well. He barely made it through the second year, and he decided he hated school. School was a government plot that people shouldn't have to go to. I started hearing things like this. And I was sending him for therapy at this point, and I heard all kinds of things. Oh, it's a tough adolescence. Oh, your son is gifted with ESP, extrasensory perception. And so he's seeing things that others don't see. And ESP is a gift, but it's also a burden. I was hearing, don't be a helicopter parent. Don't try to micromanage his life. I heard, you as the mother have to help him more. I heard all kinds of things. Never did I hear schizophrenia. We suspected some drug use. And we tried to fix it by letting him transfer from the private, academically oriented, everybody from here goes to Yale kind of high school he had made it into, to our local high school. Meanwhile, he dropped all his friends and focused on one girlfriend. He went to Israel with the friends that he had been close to, and I think this was a big moment. When they got off the bus from this amazing trip, every teen was coming off that bus, hugging each other goodbye, sobbing that they were going to miss each other. My son just walked off the bus by himself, and nobody hugged him goodbye. And this was a child who had always had 40 best friends, people calling up, everybody saying, oh, your son is the best listener. He's my best friend. He had a very active social life. And not from this trip. And one of his friends came up to me and said, well, Ben was different on this trip. He spent a lot of time by himself writing poetry instead of interacting with us. So a lot of this could be attributed to smoking pot, which she was also doing at the time. And halfway through his junior year, the third year of high school, he actually a few months shy of completing it, he dropped out. My very social son, when he entered this new school, I went with him to the guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor said, oh, you play saxophone? Maybe you can be in the band. Maybe you can do this. And my son's like, no, I'm fine. I don't need anything. I don't need anybody. My very social son was isolating, and his junior year was not fun, and he got into this crowd of people that didn't go to school and was smoking pot and trying mushrooms, and he eventually dropped out of high school, and I knew something was up. I just thought it was undiagnosed ADD or maybe bipolar or maybe drug use, which is fairly typical for families. It's called normalizing. Most of us, if we cough, we don't go, oh my God, it must be cancer. We go, oh, I have a cold. Or, you think of the most normal solution. And it wasn't until later when I started to entertain the idea that something way more serious might be wrong.
So you said after his first psychotic breakdown, you looked back and you thought there were indicators this was not just teenage issues. What would you, retrospect, what are those things that should have been red flags if you hadn't kind of normalized them? And of course, you are getting conflicting signals from everybody else as well, wasn't it?
Yes, and just to understand the story, I was a single parent with absolutely no involvement from their father at this point, who had completely disappeared without a trace and with a mystery to solve when my kids were 3 and 6. So I was the only parent involved, and I didn't have a good cop, bad cop, teamwork parenting to do. So we would go to school conferences, and they would just talk about the behavior issues. And looking back, I wish somebody in the school system had said to me, there's a lot of things that could be happening with your son. I wonder if you know anything about schizophrenia, because some of these signals, I don't want to be the deliverer of bad news, the bearer of bad news, but some of these signals could indicate that he might be developing schizophrenia. Here's a pamphlet. Educate yourself about it. I hope it's not the case. If I had known sooner that he might be developing schizophrenia, that coming home from school and going, nobody likes me, was a sign of paranoia, then my eyes would have been opened. I'll just briefly say what happened in the next year and a half of my son's life after he dropped out. he became very unrealistic. He was saying things like, I don't want to have a job that's a government plot. Again, now I know, paranoia. I shouldn't have to go to school, that's a government plot. Nobody should make me work, that's not fair. I have a dream and I know I'm going to write a poem that will cause world peace, and that's my calling. Grand delusions. Like, I know what to call them now, and at the time I just thought it was the marijuana talking. And I had him in therapy, and I thought he was being influenced by the books that he was reading. You don't know. After a while, his behavior at home started to be so odd. Like, he would stay up all night. He would walk around the neighborhood in his bathrobe. And I attributed it to drug use and gave him so many times he said, I don't want to live with you anymore. And I went to, there's an American organization, I forget what it's called, but it advocates for tough love. And so if your child moves out, don't let them move back in unless you have a written contract. I did all of that. He lived with another family for a while to get away from me. And I'm like, that's fine, but will you drive me to the therapist? Yes, I will. And every time he moved back in, he was so happy to be home. He signed a written contract about his behavior and no drug use and everything. And he broke it within 2 weeks. He had this pattern of crashing, asking for my help, agreeing to everything, a honeymoon period, and then things would get awful again. So finally, I discovered through this program that I legally didn't have to have him live with me as long as I found him a place to live. And I said, if you're going to be out of here in 3 weeks, I can either find you another family to live with or a group home to live with, or there's a troubled teen program in Montana where you'll be camping. I can send you there. Otherwise, I'm just going to change the locks and kick you out. Now, that's hard to do for a mother, but I knew I had to. And he chose this troubled teen program. He ended up being out west in America, in Idaho and Arizona and Montana for 6 months, taking him past his 18th birthday. During that time, he did very, very well with the structure. He was on no medication, but he had some odd behaviors, but the structure really held him together. Once he was 18, he ran away, and I started to get phone calls because he legally could. Mom, do you know what a psychic vampire is? They suck your energy. And he was homeless for 5.5 months, calling me every Sunday, me refusing to send him money because I wanted him to hit bottom, and him asking me to pay for a therapist, which I did. I mean, it's a crazy combination. And I just wanted him to realize he needed help, which is a place I'm still in, frankly. And during that time, I started reading, and I went to NAMI, and I started consulting people. And I realized, I looked at the list of symptoms, and I went, oh my God, my son has schizophrenia. And I would have to say that being homeless in Idaho, that was the first time I would say, yes, this is a psychotic break. Him calling me and telling me about the psychic vampires that are stealing his energy. And that's when I looked back and I saw all the prodromal symptoms. Grades dropping in school, anxiety, mood swings, paranoia. And I went, oh my gosh. And finally, he begged me to come home. And I said, only if you agree to see a psychiatrist and do what the psychiatrist does. And that's when he came home. And looking back, I wish that I had been educated, and I wish that the school psychologists and guidance counselors had been educated enough and brave enough to say to me, I hope it's not this, but it could be. Read about it. Get him help before he's 18. Because if he has the psychotic break before he's 18, you can put him in the hospital. But once he's 18, you can't. And so those are the signs that I wish I'd seen. And I do believe drugs have had something to do with it. Marijuana can trigger psychosis. I'm not a big fan of the legalization of marijuana right now because it normalizes it, and not every brain reacts well to it. So that's a long-winded answer, but it catches you up on the story in the early years. And if anybody listening is having a teenager with these extreme mood swings, look into bipolar, look into anxiety disorders, look into schizophrenia. There's evidence after evidence that if my son's illness had been caught earlier, he might be doing better than he is now.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Identifying these early warning signs.
Hmm.
What I found surprising to paranoia, yes, the mood swings, kind of what you expect more with maybe depression or bipolar disorder. I didn't realize it's kind of a key um, early sign of schizophrenia. I think that's a learning point for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did in my book, and you can see it's all dog-eared, is that I included chapter guideposts. And I know you read it, so you've seen them. So rather than interrupt the story, I would have like, chapter guideposts just explaining some things like what delusions. Here's just, delusions. People with paranoid schizophrenia may believe that others are deliberately cheating, harassing, poisoning, spying upon, or plotting against them. This is from the National Institute of Mental Health. And the family might be experiencing a mixture of dawning realization, hoping against hope, which I still do, and normalizing, and then steps to take. Keep learning. Shop for the right professional help. If your psychiatrist is not doing the job, get another one. And I know that's hard. And report the symptoms that you observe to your doctor. I would like write down the symptoms that I saw and fax them to the doctor. And any doctor that said, I don't have time to read that, I just went, well, you're not the right doctor for me, because I'm with this person 24/7. You're with them an hour a week. So, I would say to families, learn everything you can so you can keep your eyes open.
And you talked about Ben's dad and being absent, the use
Mhm.
of maybe marijuana. The other thing is the family history. I think that's kind of in the picture in some cases of schizophrenia. Is there any family history on either side
None.
at all? No.
None. And, the current thinking, because I go to conventions, I just want to keep learning, it empowers me, is that it is genetic, but not necessarily inherited, which is why you can have identical twins with technically the same DNA, although recent research has shown that DNA can change. So, and one will have schizophrenia and one will not. A typical book about this is by Wally Lamb. I know this much is true. It's about two identical twins, and I think that's the title. And it was an HBO special. You can watch it. It's one twin with schizophrenia and one without, and their complicated relationship. And if it were completely inherited, you would think that identical twins would have identical instances. Now, the chances are greater in twins. So, what we look at is that my nieces and my grandchildren might have a higher possibility of developing schizophrenia, but it's not necessarily a done deal. And so the percentages are higher. In my family, there is absolutely, well, I have to preface this with another story for another time, but discovering about 5 years ago that my father who raised me is not my biological father. So everything from that side of the family is irrelevant right now. And that's like 19 of my first cousins. So I only have to go by my mother's side of the family and my ex-husband's side, who I call William in the book. And my ex-husband's family history is difficult to discern because he was an orphan who was adopted. So it's, we have a few aunts and uncles that have come out of the woodworks, but we did have our DNA tested when I got pregnant with my son. So the short answer is there was no indication. I have no bipolar in my family. I have no schizophrenia in my family. No one has ever been on medication for mental illness. So I don't know. I do know that if this was sort of a dormant gene, like Alzheimer's is a gene it's in your DNA, but it isn't activated till you're old, generally. A schizophrenia DNA set, whatever, I think it's more than one gene, can be in your system, but it can possibly never blossom. It can blossom if it's triggered by something like marijuana or like any other substance, or like what they call a second hit,
Mm.
severe stress in your life. So both of my children were abandoned by their father. We did eventually find him again and get closure, but for 12 years, basically, he wasn't around. They didn't know where he was. My daughter's perfectly neurotypical. My son developed this illness. I don't know. His father was an alcoholic, but keep your eyes open. I say keep your eyes open. Never knew about schizophrenia. All I knew about schizophrenia was homeless people and school shootings. And again, that not necessarily having to do with schizophrenia, but that's the kind of press that it gets because it's sensational. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, your book dispels this public image of schizophrenia as the kind of the mad person walking barefoot and uh,
Mhm.
clearly. And the lack of a family history shouldn't dissuade people from considering it. I think that's the other lesson.
Exactly. I will say about that, barefoot wandering the streets,
Mm.
there is a huge difference between treated schizophrenia or treated mental illness and untreated mental illness. So many mental illnesses can have psychosis as a symptom. People with bipolar, when they're incredibly manic or even incredibly depressed, sometimes can have psychosis. People on a drug trip can have psychosis. So it doesn't necessarily mean schizophrenia, and it certainly is not the only symptom for schizophrenia. There are what they call positive symptoms, which are symptoms added to your personality, like my son says he never does, but I see that he does. Hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, feeling things, smelling things that aren't there. That's called a positive symptom. It's added to your experience as a human being. Negative symptoms are just as heartbreaking. The lack of motivation, blunt affect, where you don't feel strong emotions, the inability to plan a productive day, losing friends. There's so much that's taken away from your personality when you have a mental illness that in order to get a diagnosis, you need psychosis, but you also need some of those negative symptoms. And those are the things that was happening to my son, the negative symptoms first as he was growing up. So the more we know about it, the more we can treat these things as the brain chemical imbalances that they are. And even though medication or whatever treatment is not perfect, the earlier you catch it, the less the chance of brain damage from each psychotic event.
I mean, that's a very important lesson. And clearly, this overlap of symptoms among the mental illnesses was that kind of what happened in 2003. He had 5 admissions into a psychiatric hospital,
Yeah.
and yet he wasn't diagnosed with schizophrenia during those admissions. Is that my understanding?
Well, actually, this was after his diagnosis. We had when he was out west, I was able to consult actually an ADD specialist, psychiatrist,
Okay.
who was the kind of the last filled in the last hole in my doubts. And he said, this could be schizophrenia. I want you to, read about it. I read a wonderful and horrible book called Surviving Schizophrenia, which is like the manual of understanding. I remember I was doing a theater show at the time. My son was away, and I was, on stage singing, and then backstage I was reading this book about schizophrenia. So it was people are like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I don't know. I'm off stage for half an hour. I got to learn about my son's illness." And the more I learned, the more I knew what it was. It was clear as day. So by the time he finally took the train home from out west and I met him, I already knew his diagnosis and I brought him to the psychiatrist. The problem was, how do you treat it?
Mm.
Which medication will work? Because schizophrenia isn't an illness, it is a combination of symptoms. And you don't know which medication is going to work. And the psychiatrist, I went through several, finally said, sadly, we just keep trying different meds, and sometimes we get the diagnosis by knowing which medication works. And all the medications have side effects, and so my son didn't want to take them, and he would take them and spit them out, and he would do all other kinds of things. But when he got home from Montana, he was like showing OCD signs. He was tapping things 3 times. There are still burn marks on the ceiling of his bedroom, and I don't know why they're there. Almost as like he held a match up to the ceiling to, I don't know, chase away a demon. Like, I don't know. There are teeth marks on the windowsill. Again, I don't know what any of this was about. He still won't tell me. He still insists he doesn't have schizophrenia, except for one golden day when he thought he might recently. But one of the worst symptoms is you don't know you have it. So it's not like your kid gets cancer, not that I wish that on anybody, and goes, oh, Mom, help me. Oh, thank you for your help. Like, it's not, it's like, you're crazy. I don't have schizophrenia. I'm fine. He came home. He would stay up all night talking to a bush. And he'd wake up in the morning and tell me he got the secret of life from God, who spoke to him through a bush. If that's not psychosis, I don't know what is. I once paid him $10 to just talk about the weather for 10 minutes, just so he could have a normal conversation. It was like, I know the secret to the world. I can save everybody. He was hyper. And then again, the mood swings would continue. He would walk 3 steps forward and 1 step back. There were a lot of strange symptoms. And we went to various therapists. And one of them said, you're too close to your son. Get him his own apartment. He'll be fine. And I'm like, fine, I'll get him his own apartment. Got him his own apartment. We had finally settled on a particular medication, but he wasn't taking it. And he couldn't get a job. And he would wander the neighborhood. And he was never been violent, thank God. But I wanted him hospitalized, and no hospital would take him because he wasn't sick enough. He lived by himself. He would, I would answer the door, and he would be dirty and naked, and there would be cockroaches all over the apartment. That's not sick enough. He would come to a family meeting and be talking to people who weren't there. That's not sick enough. I don't know how it is in the UK, but here in the US, if you're not a threat to yourself or others, they won't put you in the hospital. And I had to just wait. I had to wait for him to get sick enough to be treated, because in his own apartment, with meds in his own hands, promising me he would take them, clearly wasn't working, because every medication has side effects. And who would want to take a medication for an illness you don't think you have? If it makes you gain weight and it makes you tired and it interferes with your sexual ability, I wouldn't. So finally, he was in a diner with one of his few remaining friends, and he was, not deliberately, but his behavior was scaring a child in the diner. And then he was wandering, and I called the psychiatrist. I said, I think this is it. He's scaring people. That's it, And that was his first hospitalization. And that year, we tried, the first time he was hospitalized for almost 45 days, which is unheard of, too, in the States. Because at the time, you only got a certain number of dates. And he could have signed himself out at any time, except I applied to be his conservator, which is like a guardian. And once I applied for a hearing, the hospital was obligated to keep him until the hearing. Okay. And he would not take medication, and he has the right to not take medication. So at this hearing, which was held in the hospital, and I have the scene in my book, he stood up and defended himself. I'm not sick, everybody else is sick, but the psychiatrist disagreed. And so I got right to medicate. Once they started treating him with medication, he was not his old self, but coherent, insane. So he had the diagnosis, but it wasn't until the 5th hospitalization that they finally tried a medication that worked not only on the positive symptoms, but the negative symptoms. And, at the end of my book, that medication is called Clozaril. It is inexpensive. It is the one that is most effective for many people. For some people, the only one that's effective. And I'd say for my son, that's true. Haldol works, but there's a lot of side effects to that could be permanent. And while he was on Clozaril, and when he was discharged from the hospital, I said, he doesn't live with me. You have to find him a group setting. And that's where my book ends after 7 years of being, or 5 years, I don't know, whatever, of being consistently on Clozaril whenever he didn't cheat. He went back to college. He earned college credits, got his GED, graduate equivalency diploma. And he got a job
Wow.
because, treatment is, recovery is treatment, structure, purpose, and love. Love could be of your community, of your family. And he would visit the family every weekend. And the only time he got in trouble is when he went off the meds. So that's where the book ends, the book ends right before he got the job. And I say he may never work again, but his life is worth living. And that was the hope that I ended the book on. A lot has happened since then, so he had the diagnosis, but finding the right medication I call it medication roulette. It's just really hard.
And perhaps jumping the gun a bit, but how is he now?
Right now, we're having a difficult time. So, our enemies are anosognosia, which is a medically proven diagnosis, also very common in stroke victims, which is basically his frontal cortex is impaired enough that he doesn't know he's ill. So he does not want treatment. Given his druthers, as we say here, given his choice, he would completely go off medication. And he literally cannot see that every single time he's gone off medication, he has had psychosis and gone back in the hospital. He doesn't want the medication to take credit for his success or his failure. Briefly, when my book came out, because he got a job, he was promoted out of his group home to living on his own, which did not go well. And he went off his meds and almost lost his job, started behaving poorly at work. But because he had behaved so well when he was in treatment, they still loved him. He went back in the hospital right when my book came out in 2012. And it took more court orders to get him back on Clozaril. Then he lived with us for 9 years. And this was my rule. Legally, I can't force you to take medication. But if you want to live in this house, you will do it. And for 9 years, we enforced that rule that he must be home for medication in order to sleep in this family. I can't say he didn't get away with it, sometimes spitting it out, but he was on Clozaril for 9 years. During that time, he got a job as a waiter in a restaurant, so good at it that people would go on Yelp and say what a great waiter they had, because his negative symptoms were being treated by this illness, and the consistency of being on it, I believe his brain was like rewiring itself a little bit. Unfortunately, that's not permanent. He worked his way. Now, there were a few jobs that didn't get his quirkiness. I used to say he was back 65%, and I would take it. He participated in family events. He ended up getting offered full-time work as a waiter in a family restaurant. He made so much money, he spent a lot of money, and he leased a Lexus, like he leased a car. He drove himself around. He had a life. It wasn't perfect. He didn't have a girlfriend. He was a little overweight, but he had a life. He had most of a life back. But then he started using substances again, and making sure my son took his meds meant either I'm remarried, my new husband or I had to stay up till sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning to give him his meds when he came home, because the meds made him tired. And plus he was probably going and smoking pot after his restaurant shift. And COVID came, the restaurants closed, he lost everything, structure, purpose, community, and then he started really fighting his treatment. He went back in the hospital 5.5 months during COVID, and I knew he couldn't live with us anymore. He went back in a group home on back on Haldol, which is an injection every 4 weeks, which is much more convenient, but not as effective. And he did great for a while, and then decided he was too good. He didn't need it anymore, and he started rebelling against the structure, and ended up befriending people who use drugs. And that changed everything. He stopped being able to manage his money. He was behind on his rent. His behavior when he was with the family was frightening his nieces and nephews, and he could no longer see the family unless I vetted him first. And then I got a call that he was arrested. So this is not in my updated audiobook, but it is. I have a podcast called Schizophrenia, Three Moms in the Trenches. It's two authors I met during COVID, and we started this podcast. And my son was pre-trial jail, which is like not behind bars, but, behind a locked facility for about 9 months before I was able to get him on the strength of his character and a lot of reference letters. I got him into called a jail diversion program, which is a program that's very structured. You cannot use any kind of drugs. And if you graduate, the charges are dropped. So my son did amazing in that. Like my husband was like, "Oh, we love sober Ben, sober," and he was himself again. It's the Haldol isn't great, but he was okay. But he's starting to have twitches. These are things that Haldol does. His teeth are completely rotten. We made plans to make his life better, but for the 2 days after he graduated from the jail diversion program, he was so happy to be out. I let him stay with us for a week. I found him an apartment in a semi-supported place that will give you mental health services. And for those 2 days, he was like, "I'm going to fix everything, my life. I have enough money. I'm going to get a car. I'm going to get my teeth fixed. And you know what, Mom? I think I might have schizophrenia." And then the next day, everything changed. And I suspect that's when he started smoking marijuana again. And ever since then, it has been downhill. He's in this apartment, but they found substances in the apartment. I'm just waiting for him to get hospitalized or arrested again. Sadly, all of the fresh start has now rotted away. And I live in hope. I also understand that I can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped. And so I'm in charge of his money. I pay his rent. I send him money for food, but I won't send him cash. And right now we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop, because this is the nature of schizophrenia. If it's untreated, or if treatment gets interfered with by alcohol, marijuana, or any other drug, then the decisions that are made are terrible. And the mood swings are terrible. We had an incident where he kept asking me for cash. I wouldn't give him cash. And for the first time ever, I was really frightened of him. But now, again, he's not sick enough to be hospitalized, because that's the system. Oh, that's where we are right now. I have just sent him a gift certificate to buy groceries, and he has a social worker, but he's about to get kicked out of his apartment and be homeless. And so that barefoot person walking down the street talking to himself, that could be my son. But I can't allow him back into my home. I can't help him here, and I have other people I love that I need to protect. And I have a protective order against my own son. Can this flip around? Yes, I believe it can, if he finds a community of sober people. He needs a different community. Now he has the community of felons. And he's such a good kid. He's such a kind person under there. He's so loving. First thing he said when he got out of the jail diversion was, "I have to buy gifts for my nieces and nephews because I missed their birthdays." Like, that is who he is at his core. But right now, covered by drug abuse, I don't see that person. So that's kind of where we are. So that answers that question.
It
I
does,
hope.
and a lot others as well. You are obviously still living in hope, isn't it, that things will turn around?
I believe in hope. I believe in reality. I believe in myself getting support. Look, in my head, I can make sense of it in my head. This is what it is. Like, I even wrote a second book. Here it is, Happier Made Simple,
Yes.
because I would part of what I do for a living is talk about human connection, and in my work talking about schizophrenia in the family, some of my talk is funny because he does funny things, and people were saying, how can you still be laughing, and how can you get remarried? And I'm like, listen, part of life is what happens to you, and part of life is what you tell yourself about it. And like, this isn't new. A lot of people say the same thing, but I found a lot of books on happiness were overly complicated, and lacked humor, lacked joy. And so people said, you should write a book about your theory, not my theory, but what you tell yourself. So I did. So I wrote that second book because I cannot live my life saying I'm only as happy as my unhappiest child. I can't do it. That's what people say. But I have a lot of joy in my life. I love my work. I love my art. I love acting. I love seeing faces light up when I speak about connecting with other human beings. I love my son. I just can't be around him. And this is anybody who's related to an addict will say the same thing. I have to set my boundaries. I love my daughter and her husband and my grandchildren, and I cannot sacrifice them for trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved right now. So I would say one of the secrets to living a happy, joyful life anyway is knowing that no day is perfect, to be in control of what I tell myself, to allow myself to feel the pain when I feel the pain. I'm not saying I don't cry about this. My head's okay, but my heart hurts for my child, for my daughter who has lost her brother, for my grandchildren who miss their uncle. So my heart breaks and my head copes. And so I cope by what I choose to tell myself. I cope by noticing moments of joy. I cope by having a community around me of people who understand what I'm going through and also who make art with me. By art, I mean theater and singing and music. And I cope by turning my pain into purpose. That's why I have my podcast. That's why I wrote my book. That's why I wrote my second book. That's why I'm delighted to be on your podcast. If it touches one person and makes them realize, well, maybe I need to look into this, or maybe I have to let go for a while.
Yeah.
I think we're here to learn from each other. Why else are we all on this earth? So, so turning pain to purpose is another thing that helps me. And I do have joy. I do have joy. And every time my son has been out of my life, homeless in Idaho, in jail, I've supported him as best I can. I mean, I visited him every week. I sent him money. I did what I can do. But I also know how to set boundaries. And I do what I can. But I tell myself, oh, I'm just going to pretend he's in summer camp, or he's off on a trip around the world, and I don't need my son in my life every day to be happy. I would like to know he's safe, and I don't know if he's safe, and I fear for him, but he could get better again. It's happened before. So I'm not going, I know that one of my mantras in my book, Happier Made Simple, is whatever happens, we'll handle it. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I trust all will be well somehow in whatever the universe has planned. I trust myself and my abilities. I trust that I can find the humor. I trust that I can connect with other people. And I don't waste a lot of time asking why he's ill. I just say, what can I do with this situation? And I'm not going to ignore the other people I love or the things I love to do in order to run the hamster wheel until my son says to me, I'm really ready to change, then I'm all in. But right now, that's not where we are. And so if he asks me for money in an email, I type back and go, soon as you get off drugs, let me know. So.
Well, it looks like you've struck the right balance, I think. I was going to ask how you cope, but you've already answered all that.
I think I've answered a lot of questions before you asked them. So.
But one that you haven't answered, and I think I've left it for the end, is the question of stigma, which you explored. And I think it's also related to what you said. People don't know how to relate or support somebody with schizophrenia and their family. What lessons would you want people to take regarding stigma and supporting people with?
A great question. So your audience, I hope, will include practitioners, from neurologists to social workers to police. And the first lesson to know is that when mental illness strikes, it strikes the whole family. And when you meet the family, don't assume it's the family's fault. By the time you meet the family, their loved one, it could be a parent, it could be a spouse, it could be a sibling, it could be a child. By the time you meet the family, they're at the end of their rope. The police just met me where my son is, and I had to lock the car to prevent my son from getting in because he was harassing me, wanting money. And I had to drive away. And when my son was able somehow to unlock my driver's side door, it could be that my car is old and it unlocked itself. I don't know. When he tried to get in my car to prevent me from driving away, I had to keep driving. I could not stop the car because I was afraid. And the car knocked my son down. He was fine because he ran after the car. Now, somebody could assume I'm abusive because I drove away from my son. Don't assume, because the family that you meet is not the family that they were when the loved one got ill. They have been to hell and back 100 times. The original title of my book was To Hell and Halfway Back, but my agent said no one will buy a book with hell in the title. So we did Ben Behind His Voices because he's still there. Even now, he's still there. Sometimes the emails he sends me is like, oh, how are the kids? Like, he still wants to be part of the family, but the drug use and the illness won't let him do it. So number one, mental illness happens to the whole family and to friends too.
Mm.
Number two, the family, if educated, can be part of recovery. Listen to the family when they tell you what symptoms they see. Here's what families need. It's an acronym for search. S for support. They need support. Don't blame them and tell them, oh, it's your fault. Your son needs his own apartment. They need education. E. The more families know, the more they can help. A, they need acceptance. They need to learn acceptance. And you need, as a practitioner, if you're listening, to accept the family where they are.
Okay.
I, as a family member, had to at some point understand that, yes, my son has this horrible illness. I don't like it. I don't approve of it, but I accept it. It is what it is. They need R. They need to be respected. And C, families need to learn, to have an opportunity to learn communication skills. I don't think I was at my best when I had to drive away from my son, but I was in crisis mode. I know when he's receptive how to speak to him and acknowledge the pain he must be going through. Communication skills. And H, we need hope. And we need humor. When my son was, I tell this story in the book, but as my son was, in that first group home and starting to recover a bit because he was on Clozaril, I remember talking to a social worker. And she spoke to my son. And then she spoke to me and said, how are you? And then I started to cry because no one ever asked me that question before. And when I stopped crying, she said, and how's your daughter doing? And then I started crying again. But the thing is, she asked those questions. And then, because I like balance, I said, how are you? Like social worker, I think I call her Helen in the book. How do you do this job day in and day out?
She didn't break out in tears, I hope.
Well, she didn't break out in tears, but she looked at me and she said, I'll tell you why I love this job. Because I love to see people get better. And I believe your son can too.
That's good.
And just giving me that hope
Yes.
was the gift I needed at that time. And so I've never regretted hoping. I hoped when my son got out of jail diversion that this would be the turning point. But turned out I was wrong. It's So I didn't get to be right, but I did have 2 days of being hopeful. And I'm hopeful now. It's realistic. This could happen or that could happen. I don't know. But he could get sober, but he might not. So I choose the hope. Let's say hope for the best and plan for the worst. That's kind of my life. So I hope that practitioners take away that families need search, support, education, acceptance, respect, communication skills, and hope, and that when mental illness happens, it does happen to the whole family. There are a lot of people suffering, not just the loved one. And to be aware of anosognosia, that waiting for someone with schizophrenia to ask for help is like, asking a 6-month-old to talk. They literally can't do it. And so to tell a family that, well, we can't put them in the hospital because he has a right not to go, patient's rights, what does he have the right to do? Die in the street? What does he have the right to do? Live in a box? Because that's what's going to happen. They have a right to treatment. They never tell anybody with Alzheimer's they don't have a right to treatment. Oh, they have a right to wander around. They don't do it with Alzheimer's patients, but they do it with people with schizophrenia, and they call it patients' rights when I say they have a right to be treated even if they don't know they're ill. And I got a little mad there, but that's what happens. What's happening now. Can't hospitalize him. He's not a threat to himself or others. Really? Almost knocking me out of my own car is not a threat? These are the things that happen. And then in the system, they have a right to, the minute they're stable, they're discharged without a plan. And so there's a lot to fix in the system, but all change begins with awareness. So that's what I would say are the lessons here.
Well, this podcast hopefully will be heard by as many healthcare practitioners. And the key lessons I got there is recognize it early, and then don't be too quick to send out into the community when on admission. I was going to end up on the issue of hope, but I do have a last question, which is if you have any books to recommend to listeners. I know you've already talked about one. Are there any and yours as well, of course, but any books?
Yes, so many. And if you like memoirs, mine is Ben Behind His Voices. As I said, the most recent version is the audiobook, and I'm a professional audiobook narrator. That poster is blocking my booth. These two books, my podcast co-hosts, they're both American. This is He Came In With It. That's Miriam or Mimi Feldman, one of my co-hosts, and her son. They both have sons with schizophrenia. Mimi, it's a memoir, and this is a self-portrait her son drew. I mean, there's so much talent wasted in the world when people are ill. And this is Mindy Greiling's, it's called Fix What You Can, and it's a story of her son, but also her story as a legislator in her state trying to change the laws. Surviving Schizophrenia there's many, get the most recent if you want to learn about schizophrenia. There's one in Canada, After Her Brain Broke, which is a really good book. We interviewed someone on our podcast, Nicole Drapeau something. Anyway, it's a guidebook. It is American, but it just tells you all the resources, criminal justice system, educational resources. It's a great listing. So you can check that out. There's a doctor called Dr. Laitman who advocates for Clozaril to be used more frequently, and he writes a book about Laitman, Laitman, Rob Laitman. He writes a book about recovery is possible with the use of Clozaril for serious mental illness. So there's a lot of resources. The Schizophrenia and Psychosis Alliance, Action Alliance, has a lot of resources listed. So I would, check out those. In America, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. In the UK, there's a schizophrenia. Do you know there's Schizophrenia Alliance or something? I'm not sure. Wait a minute. It's in my book. And Australia, we have a lot of listeners in Australia, and so at the end of my book, so there's Narcotics Anonymous also. I think it's saanonymous.com, schizophrenia.ca. uh, American Psychiatric Association. So there's a lot that's available. There's also a website called bringchangetomind.org that was started by actress Glenn Close, and she talks about stigma and mental illness. And so there are a lot of resources out there. Look for them, follow them. If you are a family member, education and support is your best friend. Look for classes where you can learn about these illnesses and be with other people going through what you're going through. You are not alone. That's another good book that just came out. You Are Not Alone. That's written by the folks at NAMI, and a new one just coming out. You Are Not Alone for Parents and Caregivers. So that's a bunch of resources, and of course my podcast,
Yes.
Schizophrenia: Three Moms in the Trenches. We interview a lot of people about marijuana. We interviewed Dr. Joseph Lieberman, wrote a book, Malady of the Mind. That's another really good informational one. So if you check out our episodes, you can see a lot of fantastic resources.
Okay. A lot of resources there, obviously.
And you have a book.
Yeah. Well, yes, not high profile, but yes, I do have a book called Surfing the Brain, which talks about neurology generally. Psychiatry is a bit on the borderlands of what we do, so I'm kind of dabbling into a territory beyond me, but I thought I should include mental health illnesses in this podcast. And there's a website where I've also included new psychiatry topics called Neuro Checklist. So thank you for helping me to promote my two resources. Randye Kaye, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I've actually gained a lot of perspectives, and I do hope listeners and viewers would take a lot from that as well. And for the audience, if you don't want to miss the next episode of the podcast, there is a channel on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes you might want to subscribe to. Until the next episode of the podcast, thank you very much for joining me. And Randye Kaye, thank you very much. And apologies for getting your name wrong at the beginning.
That's perfectly all right. It's spelled so strangely. And if people want to go to my website, it's randyekaye.com, but it's RANDYEKAYE.com. So that gave me an opportunity to talk about that. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, or have a nice morning there.